Hello, welcome to my channel. We are back in my sewing corner. Today I have a little bit of a smaller and simpler sewing project. I'm trying to put a few more of these into my general sewing practice online. So today I will be working on a blouse from the 1940s. I'm going to be doing view 2 with a little bow as well as the short sleeves. I'm not always the biggest fan of long sleeves, especially in the material I'm working with today. I'm pretty excited about this. I like the tucks. It appears there's buttons under these tucks, so I'm excited to learn a new technique. This blouse has a fly front and dart tucks at the front waistline, 3 box pleat style blouse front. Upper edges of front and back are gathered into shoulder yoke. Style 2 has a tie collar and short sleeves. I'm excited to kind of kick off this shorter series. I theoretically kicked it off with that color blocked dress the other month, but my goal is to do one more elaborate sewing project and one simpler sewing project a month, and this is the fabric I'm going to use for this guy. This is a pretty crisp cotton, so I think it will lend well to this type of structured shirt. I think it will hold well. This actually, my Patreons voted between I think 6 fabrics, and this one ended up winning by one person, so I might revisit some of the other fabrics as I continue to sew in this series. I love the little, I think they're plums, but you could argue either way, or they could be crab apples maybe. And then regular apples. I think this is very cute. As you guys all know on this channel, I love a blue fruit. I think this will really lend itself to that styling. That is a pretty straightforward project. So with that, we're gonna head straight into cutting out my fabric. The first thing I need to do is a full bicep adjustment. So I am adding basically another inch. Technically this is right on the line where I wouldn't adjust it, but I know ultimately as someone who's been lifting to make my biceps bigger, having the extra space will be a good thing in the long run. So I'm taking in the time to do that. And then from there, I'm cutting out the shirt as normal. I made a big mistake here. Can you spot it? And you'll see in just a few minutes what I did here. That was a big whoops. Before we get there, I'm making all of my marking transfers. There's a lot of transfers to make here. Here I decided to use my blue water-soluble ink to mark these guys because I want something that's pretty permanent, but easily washed out. If I was to use chalk on this, there is a possibility the chalk would stain. So I'm going water soluble to take care of that. And as always, we are in the spot in the video where I remind you that I do have a Patreon. Currently, I pay money to be here. I don't even make money, so I always appreciate any support I get over there. Or alternatively, if you just want to make a one-time coffee purchase, I would greatly appreciate it, and you can do that over on my Ko-fi. I am first working on the buttonhole side of this shirt, which is the most complicated part. So I'm figuring out the way all the tucks work. First, we have a fold over where the buttonholes will actually sit on this little flap here. And then I'm just marking this tuck right here that's at the further end. I am going to leave the tuck in the middle untouched because I think I want to put my buttonholes earlier than the instructions say, which is what I'm doing here with my buttonhole foot. The instructions don't have you add the buttonholes till the end, but it's going to be way easier to not have to avoid the main flap that's going to eventually cover the buttonhole than it will be to do this later. So I think I'm just going to do it right now. I mean, I don't anticipate that I will change where the buttons go. I did add an extra button one lower than the pattern calls for because 1950s shirts were definitely made to be tucked in, and that means that for me there's not enough buttons for how you would wear it more modernly. And then with the buttonholes in, I'm now going to sew the tucks. The tucks are obviously on the outer part of the shirt, and then I'm ironing everything in place, and I can tell something isn't quite correct here with the way the tucks are laying. I just think they look too long and weird, so I'm going to go back and consult the instructions. And I was right, something was up, so here I am making them box pleats. These were supposed to be box pleats to start with, which is clearly illustrated on the pattern, but you know, sometimes we just make assumptions, and that's why you do read the instructions. I skip instructions a lot, however, in this case, I will need to reference them quite a bit because I don't totally understand what's happening. And then to get my presses extra pressed this round, I am using It's Some Soak. It's like it helps press things better. I also really enjoy how it smells. I use this anytime I am doing something that I need the press to be really strong and last a long time. And here you can see the pleats laid out. I'm now reconsulting the instructions because it's asking me to whip stitch something down here and I'm not understanding it at all. So I decided to pivot to the other side of the shirt to delay having to figure out what it is even talking about. This one is much more straightforward, having just one tuck on this side and then just a simple fold over. And here you see the mistake I alluded to. spot it yet. Yes, I did indeed make 2 of the same side of the shirt. So while looking at these, I decided I'm going to recut the side that I just made because it took a lot less work. So I'm very carefully doing that right now, taking my completed piece to make sure that they look right. I'm also making sure the bowls kind of align in a stripe around the body just for max good looks. Since I'm recutting this, I may as well put that effort in. So I'm just going to recut, transfer all the markings, and then I'm going to redo everything I just did, which in this case was 1 tuck and a fold over, so not too shabby. After this, I finally feel like I understood what the pattern was asking of me for this turnover. So what it's asking for is there's kind of like a top flat part of a placket of a collared shirt, and the tuck is in the middle of it. So what they're asking you to do is cut the tuck kind of in the middle where it's marked, and then you're just doing a double turn fold, and then you're just sewing that, like whip stitching it down to get the straight across thing that you would normally get by sewing them right sides together and flipping it out. But here in this case, this is how you're doing it instead, with just a tiniest bit of hand sewing. And now I am going to transfer marks for the buttons themselves. I again like to do this when things are really flat so they're pretty accurate. I've learned for me with buttons and buttonholes, the flatter the garment is, the more accurate and the less they're going to gape. So that is when I do things. And now I'm putting in all the gathering stitches that is going to gather this into the yoke. This shirt is a little bit unique in that it has a yoke that goes on the back as well as to the top of the shoulder. So my like center armhole is actually on the yoke, but these pieces need to be gathered to the yoke, and that will make the room for the bust. And here I am doing the actual gathering onto the yoke. So here I am doing the back part first, and then I'll do the front right after. And with this being a tightly woven cotton, I am going to just be using a pinking sheer finish. I love this for something like this. Honestly, pinking shears are my preferred fabric finish for the most part, and I love when I have a fabric that's tightly woven enough to use it. And then from here, I'm gonna press all of the stitches from the yoke up into the yoke. Another thing you could do here if you wanted to is you could actually have a lined yoke, and it would actually cover all of the seam allowance and you wouldn't even need to finish the seams, but I didn't want to do that for this garment. What I'm going to do here is I will be sewing on the buttons to where I've marked, as well as opening the buttonholes. Fancy schmancy hidden buttonholes. And I'm doing all of this, and then what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do a quick dip of all of the pleats, areas of this garment that in my opinion need marking removal, because I'm going to try to shoot the reveal today. So I'm going to do that. I also think it will help with some of the folding on the pin tucks if I actually iron it while it's damp. So yes, that is the plan at the moment, just to try to again get a lot of these marks out of the shirt. You know what, we'll start by ripping open the buttonholes. This is of course media on my mind. Today we're gonna do something a little bit different. Usually I go through all the different media that I'm consuming, but today I wanted to talk about one piece of media that I've been thinking about a lot, which like in a very silly way. Like, don't get me wrong, I understand that not reality TV is not this serious, but I am talking about the documentary Reality Check Inside America's Next Top Model, which premiered actually a while ago. This is a very out-of-date conversation, but this documentary has been living in my mind rent-free for a minute. Background on me, I loved America's Next Top Model. I loved it for the fashion. It was my first experience as a kid seeing queer people on my TV, and not just seeing queer people on my TV, but seeing people talk about it not being okay to basically belittle queer people. And yes, is that a little bit depressing that that's the first time I ever saw that as a queer teen? Yeah, it is, but it speaks to where I grew up, right? America's Next Top Model is like kind of for me a foundational series, and also to like the bad parts of it. I do think America's Next Top Model has something to do with some of my body image issues for sure. I will not say that it only did positive things for me, because yes, I do think there's like negative parts and points to it. For all of that said, I just kind of wanted to talk about my critique of Netflix's documentary. I felt that it was a very, I just felt like it lacked a lot of nuance, and as somebody who I would say is like a super fan of the show, I've probably watched all of the available seasons gosh, almost over probably 10 times through, so I'm really familiar with the show, almost embarrassingly so. And I want to be clear, I'm going to sound like I'm defending the show, and in certain ways I am, but also I think it's really easy to look back and critique stuff without thinking about where the times were. I don't know, like especially the early seasons, those were some dark years for women's body image in general. And also, reality TV was trying a lot of not okay things at the time. It was kind of, I wouldn't say like a new format, but the way it was being used was changing quite a bit. I also think like you can't critique it today without also thinking about its time and place. Because my first critique of this documentary is I think it lays far too much of the blame on Tyra. Not that what Tyra did was not wrong. She definitely did a lot of really inappropriate things, including encouraging, blackface in the shoots. Definitely said some things about body image that were pretty rough. However, I have feelings about laying the blame on a Black woman for a time that the people in charge in media were very much white men. I think like when you think about how the Epstein files intersects with this, and specifically with women's body issues of specifically that time, when you think of Harvey Weinstein being pretty active in field, I don't think you can leave all the blame on Tyra. Don't get me wrong, I think Tyra's kind of a psycho. I feel uncomfortable with how much heat she's taking when I don't think Ken Mock, who was also on the documentary, is taking half the heat she is, and he was the actual producer. Also, I don't buy Ken Mock's and Tyra's we didn't know all of this was happening behind the scenes. And I didn't appreciate the complete lack of apology or accountability that they both had. But again, I think time and place, and I think it's really easy to put two non-white people and make them take accountability, even though the networks and everybody approving things were likely white men, a very specific type of white woman. To climb that high as a woman at the time, you had to do some things. And I'm not saying sleep around. I'm saying that you had to kind of be brutal. So I felt uncomfortable at Tyra taking all of the blame. I felt also uncomfortable of I didn't think either of the Jays took any accountability or Nigel, and I don't know why they're getting off so easily when they had real power, and Nigel said a lot of creepy things over the years, which I know that was kind of his persona as a judge, but there's a power dynamic that makes that quite inappropriate. I don't think the Jays or Nigel are nasty people. I do think that, again, there was a level, I just think we have to be honest about what the time was like and what was on TV and things like that. And then I also have very different feelings about, I think, the critique intensity on the show. I think it's because I went to design school where learning to take critique is actually a huge part of your training, because you're going to be taking a lot of feedback in the workplace and you need to learn how to mentally handle it and handle it professionally. And unfortunately, I think modeling is a very similar world. And the bigger unfortunate part about modeling is, unfortunately, your body is your product and is part of what you will get critiqued on, as well as your posing and how you look, because essentially what you are selling when you're a model is how you look. And you're going to get feedback and critique that is not very nice, and you're going to have to handle it well. Are the power dynamics when that happens absolutely screwed up? Yes. But as somebody who, again, I think so much of my design school training was learning to take feedback, because when you're in a creative field, you have a lot of people who don't even know what they're talking about who give you feedback. I've had really unprofessional things said to me as a designer, and I'm not saying that those things are okay. And again, I'm not saying that the power dynamic isn't screwed up, because when I've had experiences with people being very rude to me in my career, there's always been a power dynamic involved where I can't do much about it. And I'm not saying all of that is right, but I am saying realistically, if you want to take a job as a model, especially at that time, but I think it's still true in this time, you have to be able to take feedback and take critique that's unprofessional, and you have to learn to kind of hold your tongue, and that I know is not a fun thing to hear, but that's unfortunately the reality of if you want to work in that industry, the same way that if you want to work in design, you're going to get unprofessional feedback sometimes from people with too much power. Again, I know that's not a pleasant thing to hear, but it's something that is just realistic about creative jobs. I've had really rude things said to me on the job. And again, I'm not saying that people being unprofessional and saying mean things is okay. I'm just saying there is a reality to learning how to take that feedback. And I actually think America's Next Top Model was training them in that feedback, not dissimilarly to the way I was trained to take feedback in design school. So that's just a different perspective on critique. I talk a lot to people who did not go through a creative professional school, and they don't quite know what I mean by all of that. And they're like, no, it is like really harsh and really rude. And I'm like, well, people in power are really harsh and rude. Like it is what it is. And that's not to say we shouldn't strive for a better industry and strive for a better world. But again, there's also a certain amount of reality that exists, and if you want to do something, there's a certain amount of stuff that you have to take. That was kind of one of my initial thoughts about kind of the critique of the harshness of the critiques at America's Next Top Model. Having watched the show a lot, and again being a creative myself, I don't actually feel like that many of the critiques go too far. Telling people not to eat is not acceptable. Even when Janice said things like that, it always felt a little bit facetious to me, and maybe I'm picking that up wrong, but I think sometimes she was joking, and again, that doesn't make it okay. But like, I just feel like there was a real nuance not talked about this. And like, also America's Next Top Model definitely promoted more body inclusivity than a lot of things on TV at that time, which again, low bars in hell. We're talking heroin chic era. We're talking a really, really unhealthy looking era of like beauty. And again, I also have said that like, I think as I've gotten older, that influence of America's Next Top Model absolutely impacts my view of my body, and I have to remind myself regularly that I'm not supposed to look like I'm an 18-year-old 5'10" model. Another thing that I thought was like super biased in the film, to be clear, again, I'm not excusing what happened on the sets, but I think it was Kenya who she was on a set and a male model was inappropriate with her, and there was kind of like a call out at Mr. J for not like protecting her. And Mr. J actually wrote an article recently saying that in the documentary he did actually talk about how he went to the directing team and asked if there's something that they could do to remove Kenya from the situation, and was basically told it wouldn't be fair. So he did try to advocate for her. And also, if you actually watch that scene, which Netflix strategically I think didn't show this part, he does explicitly tell the male model to stop touching her. And I'm not saying again that this was all great stuff, but I think leaving that out of the documentary just clearly showed that there was a very clear agenda trying to happen. And again, I think the way they edited Tyra, I think there was such an agenda here, which most documentaries there is an agenda. It's just been very interesting to see kind of Gen Z's reaction to this show that is so kind of formative to me. They're not wrong, but again, in the time and place, things are just like different. And that doesn't make it okay, but like, I'm just a big believer in context is key, right? However, that said, I do think Tyra Banks absolutely advocated for the angry Black woman trope. I think she made sure there was one of those every single season, and I think it was really inappropriate the way she did it and the way she framed it. And then I just wanted to talk for a second about Miss J. Miss J's in the documentary. Miss J said the shadiest things in judging, but I also think a lot of that was queer humor. Again, not necessarily saying it's okay, especially because if you don't spend time in queer spaces, you wouldn't necessarily get it. But it's not that dissimilar to how drag queens are, you know, quote unquote shady. I don't know. I don't think that they deserve tons of critique for that, especially because I think this show really profited off of queer culture. And while it did give back to it some narratively wise, talking about, again, this was a very impactful show for me because it was the first time I saw an adult with power essentially say that you can't bully people for being gay. But there's a lot of drag culture that comes on this show. There's a lot of just kind of counterculture, and I think this show wouldn't have been this show without actually both the J's and the queer culture they brought with it. The other thing is about this documentary is, so I've been very keyed into kind of all of the different America's Next Top Model rhetoric over the years, including what the winners have talked about, the past winners, about what happened to them after the show. The other thing about the Netflix documentary is I don't feel like they highlighted that well, and I think it says a lot that a lot of the winners, and I would say people who've been the most outspoken in recent years about what happened to them on the show, weren't included on the show. I don't know, something about that is fishy to me, and I don't feel like they covered the parts of the show that were actually the worst, outside of what happened to Shandy, of course. I had no idea, and watching that documentary, I was really horrified. But the rhetoric's been out there a long time, like how Tyra has specifically talked about it being a place and time and not apologizing, and like the fact that the winners didn't actually always even get their earnings and things like that. Like all of that has been out there for a really long time, and to me this documentary, if you know about that, was nothing new, and even I think missed some really, really important context If you actually want to learn more about the negative impacts, like the true negative impacts about America's Next Top Model, I would recommend, instead of watching this documentary, listening to the podcast, The Curse of America's Next Top Model. I think it is a much more nuanced discussion. I also think, again, it puts forward more of the issues that I think were the important issues in the show than Netflix did. I feel like Netflix didn't really dive deep into what, in my opinion, again, aside from Shandy, is the real controversial like bullshit that happened on that set. I had a lot of thoughts. I don't actually think I recommend the documentary at all. Again, if you want to learn more, I would just listen to the podcast. The podcast actually speaks firsthand to contestants. Curious if you watched it, what you thought. Do I have any super fans of America's Next Top Model here? That's it. I am now going to give this a quick try on. Make sure, typically when I make a 1940s blouse, I don't actually want all the tucks because it makes it uncomfy and not look good around my middle. And for me, it's important for modern day that these shirts look good untucked, and the tucks often take that away. So I'm going to give this a try on, and then hopefully I'll like it. I won't put in the tucks, and I will real quick wash all of the blue ink out of it. After getting the buttons fixed on, I have tried on the shirt, checked that it fits the way I'd like it to, confirmed that I didn't want to put in the tucks the pattern calls for. I don't like the tucks. The tucks are really designed for only tucked in shirts, and I want this shirt to have the option of not being tucked in as well. So I am skipping those tucks, and instead I am now just going straight into a double turn hem, and then we'll get to hop into figuring out this bow collar. First thing is stiffening up with some interfacing. I used my stiffer wall wax roll of the two that I have. I think this was maybe a touch on the stiff side. However, I wanted the bow to really stick out and be emphasized as opposed to kind of like limp. So I intentionally made this choice, but I think you could argue it technically should have been a little bit lighter of an interfacing. And here I have made another error. I don't know why I thought the collar bow was this large, but I did. So I'm sandwiching pieces together and sewing them together in a way that doesn't make sense at all. And it takes me quite a bit to figure out that it doesn't make sense. I actually have to start turning them to figure it out. And once I did figure it out, it led to quite a bit of unpicking. Always a bummer, but it is what it is. This has been a project that I didn't read the instructions all the way through before making. I kind of figured I knew everything, and clearly that has been a little bit of a mistake here. But now, once it's unpicked, I am taking my interfaced piece and I am folding it hot dog style, I guess you could say. And then I'll just sew just the corners with the bows that go to the marks that the pattern indicates I should sew to. And as always, the pressing of the collar, especially something that's going to stand out as much of this bow, deserves a lot of work. So here I am trying to get the edges pressed out. So now I am pinning the seams of the sleeves together. I'm excited to finally be working on the sleeves, and because I've done so many tucks in this pattern, I think I can actually predict what they're going to do here, but of course I am going to read the instructions this time to not get myself in trouble. Here I am derailing a bit from the instruction because I like to do a one fold over to give my hem on the inside of the shirt a finished hem instead of just leaving it raw. So that's what I'm doing here. And then I'm pressing the kind of actually cuff edge down, but this is how they show you doing it in the instructions, is first you'll kind of press to the cuff edge all the way down, and then you will slip stitch. And because I'm sitting down to hand stitch to slip stitch that hem, I am also actually slip stitching the collar hem, or I guess it's not really a hem, but I'm slip stitching the collar down, as well as sticking my label in here. I try to not do this by hand all the time, but it feels like lately I keep forgetting to add it in the steps where it would make sense. So here I am adding it now. And now you can see finally that I am slip stitching the hem here down. And now I'm putting in the easing stitches to the sleeve head before finally actually folding and pressing that cuff out here. Yes, it was a long journey to get here because I did so many other steps in the middle. This was pretty easy and straightforward, and it was nice that I didn't mess this up because I feel like in general I have made some bad choices around this pattern. And then after easing in the sleeve and sewing it in, I am now just finishing that up with a pinking. Sometimes I do this with a binding, but right now I'm okay with the pinking because this actually feels pretty good in my shoulders. For shirts that don't feel great in my shoulders, I actually like to reinforce the armhole because I am known to rip an armpit here or there. But with that, I am all ready for the reveal. All right, you've seen the reveal. I hope you enjoyed it. We're getting some sunshine here in Seattle today and I am loving it, but I have to get through this before the sun goes down, so this will probably be a quicker outro than usual. As always, I'm going to do a cost breakdown, then I'm going to go into my final thoughts on the project, and lastly, we will talk about what is helping me hope-wise. So for the blouse, the fabric was $32. I only needed 2 yards. That always makes things cheaper. The notions were $2.70. Shirts take less notions than like dresses and things. It takes less thread, less likely to require a zipper. In this case, I used buttons. Pretty affordable in the notions department as well. And then for the pattern, I spent $9.76. This was an eBay pattern that there's a couple vendors on eBay that price all of their patterns under $10, but you take the risk that they are not checked. So this was one of my gamble patterns and the gamble paid off. It does not always, but here it did. But that brought my supply total to $44.46, which actually for a very, very detailed cotton blouse, I think this is a great price, especially something that's printed in the olden days, so higher quality print than what we see now in a lot of cases. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. Now pivoting over to hours and labor taken. On this channel, I always like to talk about labor. Most of you, I guess, who are watching, me included, we make our living via our time and our labor. So I always think it's important to highlight this. Of course, there's like a lot of reasons you would not pay me, a tech worker, to sew a blouse. One of them including the rent in the city for a factory would alone be not worthwhile, but that doesn't mean that we still shouldn't talk about it. I took 5 hours and 45 minutes to make this shirt, which honestly, not too bad. That's kind of long for me for a shirt. Shirts, I often come out a little bit under 4 hours, but this shirt was a little bit more complex. Took a little bit more of me mulling over pattern instructions, and I made some silly mistakes that probably lost me about an hour, which it happens. Of course, when I'm going to put this into a wage, I'm going to put it in a living wage for me as far as living here. So of course, my living wage is going to be higher than in other parts of the country, coming in at $51 for a wage that you aren't just getting by on, but a wage you can actually thrive and live your life on, which in my opinion is a living wage. If you are working a job, I think that you should be able to enjoy your life. Certainly the executives at these companies are enjoying theirs on your labor and on your efforts. So I would take that $51 an hour and multiply it by 5 hours and 45 minutes, which would bring me to $293.25, which means I would have to sell this blouse for $337.71 to be able to make enough money to live. That's not particularly reasonable for most people for a blouse. However, it is always important to think about where our clothes come from, because all of our clothes are made with human hands. As of now, there are no magical clothing robots. So yes, we have machines, but at the end of the day, you need a person to guide those machines. Moving into my thoughts on the project. Here she is. I'm actually very pleased with this blouse. I find blouse patterns to be really hit or miss. Sometimes I make up a blouse and I love it. Sometimes I make up a blouse and I'm like, ooh. So I'm really happy with this one. I think it's really cute. I wore it to work the other day and I wore it actually a bit differently than I styled it for the reveal, and I wish I styled it for the reveal the way I styled it for work. Instead of tying the bow, which I actually find a knot around my neck to be a little bit uncomfortable, I just took these two things together. I'll put a photo of how I wore it and put a brooch here, and I thought that was a really cute way for me to add some jewelry. I definitely think I'll be making this blouse pattern again because I think it's really cute. I think it's really quite a special piece with the tucks and the bow. I will say, like, I'm really pleased with this piece. I love to give a blouse pattern a try, but sometimes I have to make so many modifications for it to look the way I want that it is not particularly worth it. So I'm pretty pleased with that. During the making process, like I alluded to, I made so many kind of silly mistakes that I shouldn't have made. No matter how experienced you get in sewing, you make mistakes. It's just kind of the way life works. And it's part of making new patterns. Honestly, sometimes it's even part of revisiting old patterns. I mean, I already styled it 2 different ways, so I think this actually fits in with my wardrobe very well. And I'm definitely thinking about, like, what happens if I make a solid linen shirt that's like in this cut and then I add lace? Like, that feels really cute and girly, but something that like I can mix and match and make like kind of more separate outfits with. I even think this could be cute under like an overall. I think this is a really versatile and useful pattern for me, and I'm excited to make some other blouses using it. Honestly, I love probably about 1 out of 3 blouse patterns that I make up, and the other 2 I like but would take so many adjustments that it's not worth it for me. The other thing I was unsure when I made this project, blouses are make or break when it comes to material, and sometimes when I use a cotton like this, it's too stiff to look good for the blouse, but I think I made good choices this time. So yeah, I'm really quite pleased with this. I think I'm gonna use this pattern a ton more. I'm proud of this guy. And as I make more kind of like smaller or lower effort projects on this channel for my sanity, you're gonna probably see me make some blouses that I'm like, eek! So, you know, that's just sometimes the way sewing works. Sewing is experimental and it is an art form. As a result, sometimes it doesn't work well. Experimentation and creativity are not guaranteed 100% success. With that, we're gonna go into Hope Helps. This week is a things in my life that make me personally hopeful and how I am coping with everything going on in the world and keeping myself focused on the future and making it better. Quite frankly, I had a hard time coming up with something new to talk about here. I feel like I kind of iterate the same points over and over. One of the things giving me hope right now is we're getting to spring in Seattle, which means the weather is a little bit nicer. You can see I have sun on me, that's why I'm lit so unevenly. Spring is why I live in Seattle. Seeing all of the flowers bloom, the birds sing, and things just kind of hitting their cycle. And of course our cycles of nature aren't really totally in sync right now because of all of the different things going on with climate change. Something that I always center on when spring comes around is celebrating the fact that no matter what happens, the flowers bloom, the birds sing. Like, nature is consistent and constant, and I really enjoy that. And I've been trying to focus lately on really appreciating nature as I feel frustration with man-made things and really stay in touch, you know, go out and touch grass. I'm trying to right now be really mindful of my doom scrolling, and if I notice myself scrolling too much, I make myself go on a walk and I really try to focus on just small things that are delightful. I find that there's just a lot of intentionality in going outside and making yourself focus on things outside that make you happy. I don't know, I'm sure there's people who truly you can find nothing redeeming about being outside, but I find myself appreciating seeing the new tiny sprouts coming up. Maybe I see a moth that I haven't seen before, or just like appreciating that squirrels are silly. I just try to really like go outside during times like this where the future feels really uncertain for a ton of reasons. And I try to go outside and just find things that delight me. I'm a relatively easy person to please, but I would actually argue becoming a person who is easy to please is a practice. I don't think there's some people who are easier to please than others. I think it's a mindset. I feel like I talk a lot on this channel about being somebody who has worked really hard on keeping a mindset that's just a little bit more positive. I always feel like you're all probably like find it hard to believe. Even just 6 years ago, I was so much more anxious. I was so much more in my head, and I was not looking for things that delighted me. Instead, I feel like I was looking for things that made me sad. I always say, with the caveat of I needed medication to get myself out of that. It was not something I could just magically do on my own. But as I continue to try to be a person that practices mindfulness and just different coping techniques, one of the things is instead of focusing on all of the things that make you upset, focusing on the things that give you joy. And it doesn't mean that your feelings aren't valid, and like it doesn't mean that I don't still have real sad and real angry cries semi-frequently. I absolutely do, because I am a big believer in processing all of your feelings, including the negative ones. I'm not talking about like ignoring negative feelings, because I think there's a lot of reasons that that's really bad for us. But I'm talking on also making sure that you're giving yourself lots of space to enjoy things and find like little things that make you happy. Some days all I have is that nature is naturing. I find so much joy in nature, and I love the constantness of nature. And I also love that nature constantly changes, and there's different seasons and even different weather patterns. We're right now in it drops and gets really cold and freezes right now, and then it's like warm and rainy, and then it clears and the temperature drops again. And I try to just find a lot of appreciation for the fact that things always change, and look to kind of nature to remind myself that things always change while they also always stay the same. So it's like it's a balance, and I think all of that's really important. And I would definitely encourage you during these times, get outside, touch grass. Literally, if it's like taking your crochet or knitting outside. If you're not in outside weather, stare out a window for a while, watch some birds. I think bird identification can be really fun. I understand, as somebody who firmly identifies as an indoor cat, I understand not having a deep love for being outside, so I like have my outside times in bursts, and I have my ways of making that more comfortable for me, but I do really encourage finding that connection to nature because I think that's something that can continue to have us hopeful, especially as we are going into spring, which is, I feel like, prime hope time. So yeah, spend some time outside, appreciate nature. I believe nature just has such a power to center us. The older I get, the more I appreciate nature, I think, and I am really lucky to live in a city with a lot of nature in it. I'll try to find a link for it, and I know this is not media on our mind, but I listened to a podcast about coyotes and how adaptable and cool coyotes were. And as someone who grew up around kind of some of the coyote fear-mongering, it was really fun to learn about kind of all the cool things about coyotes. And I saw an urban coyote the other day, which they are where I live in Seattle, and I just like really appreciated the things that I could learn from that coyote. I believe there's just so many things about nature that we can learn from and grow from. I feel like the older I get, the more, in some ways, open-minded I've become about different practices of keeping my mind sane. These were all things that when I was younger, and again, quite frankly, I had really bad chemical imbalances. I couldn't imagine myself being this person. And every year I move more and more towards the person I want to be, which is a lot more stable and a lot less reactive. And I think I talk about this all the time, but our minds are one of our biggest tools in resistance, and specifically giving ourselves tools to be resilient and unrattled. So that way in a crisis, we can actually be really helpful. And I feel like those are all practices that I keep very alive for myself. I believe so much in a stability of mind as a form of resistance. Hopefully you enjoyed this kind of shorter little project. Let me know, did you like something like this? Would you rather go through like a magazine? I would appreciate feedback. I'm trying to figure out how I can be here 3 weeks out of 4 and be sustainable in my workload. Transparently, this first part of the year has been really unsustainable for me, but that's because I've had so many big projects because of the events I'm doing. Now I'm going to settle back down into projects that should only take 1 weekend. So hopefully I'll start to feel a little bit less burnt out, but transparently, I'm feeling a little bit more burnt out right now. So I would appreciate feedback on kind of these lower effort videos, and if you enjoy them, which I've talked generally when I make a lower effort video about it being lower effort, so which lower effort videos you enjoy. I don't think anybody's mental health depends on my consistency, don't get me wrong. I think it's nice to have creators that you can consistently look forward to their videos, especially since I know some of you have mentioned my videos being kind of grounding for you. So it's something that I'm not going to show up at the cost of my own health, but there are a lot of things I can do to make this more sustainable for me, keep the joy going for you. So I always, want this feedback, because I always feel a little insecure when I do a smaller project that oh, this isn't that great of a video. I am back next week. I'm gonna have a fabric haul from y'all for my first kind of half of the year of traveling. After this, I don't travel for quite a while, which means I will not be purchasing fabric for quite a while. So I will bring you all of my traveling fabric stuff, which is usually the best stuff I bring in for the year. But yeah, this has been a very Q1 to get in the business has been an intense quarter for me on YouTube, just because of all the different events between Frocktails and Emerald City Comic Con and now Easter Egg Strut. Those are 3 of my biggest projects of the year. Having basically each of those projects are projects that take a month all in a row like that is pretty exhausting for me. So I'm also thinking next year about how I can do this more sustainably. And I guess as your bonus tip for keeping yourself steady, always think about how you can do things in a more sustainable way for you. There's lots of different ways to do things that are less exhausting, and it is okay to be less exhausted. I stopped putting myself on the pressure on myself to always do these giant videos. And once I did that, it felt better. As you can see, I'm still a little insecure about it, but that's what growth is like. Growth isn't comfortable, and part of my growing is understanding my limits and sticking to them. And that's not that easy for me because I am somebody who mentally doesn't have tons of limits, but physically and just also due to physics have limits. I only have so much time, I only have so many hours, and I always want to do so much. I will see you next week. As always, if you're still here, I think you like me, you should definitely subscribe and stick around. I'm here, like I said, 3 out of 4 weeks. And then, of course, if you want to support me financially, I pay to run this channel. I pay to be here every week. I pay about $1 and I can't remember how many cents an hour to work on this channel. This is not something that makes money, so I always appreciate any financial things you want to throw my way. You can do that either via my monthly memberships on Patreon, or you can just do a one-time coffee over on Ko-fi. I always really appreciate those. Of course, you can always support me for free by giving this a thumbs up and commenting down below. With that, I will see you next week. Bye!